so please welcome Michael Wohl.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
It's very nice. I got really curious about 360 video a few years ago, and actually something I've been, curious about VR stuff for a long time, as I think many people are. I mean, so there were a small number of people's hands who went up about who's actually working in 360 video. How many of you have watched VR or 360 video stuff? Almost everybody. Yeah, more than half certainly. And like, is that mostly like cardboard viewers, or like just on your phone, just tilting your phone around like that? Some mix of those things. Anybody working, like, have an Oculus Rift or a Vive or any of the higher end? A couple people, small number, almost nobody. Basically, I think one half, and one you share one with a friend. It is still early days for this medium, and Michael just sort of implied that it is the future, and I think that I'm honestly not sure. I've been really digging in very deep into it for a couple of years now and learning everything I could about it, because I wanted to know if it's viable yet. Like, I wanted to learn, is this medium here? And the truth is, it's still happening. Like, it's still growing, but the good news, if you're excited about it, is that there is a tremendous amount of money from Google and Facebook and Samsung and a number of other very large companies that are investing very heavily in trying to urge adoption, get the goggles and the playback devices to a point where they are affordable and lightweight. And right now, the truth is, it's a hassle, right? For the best experience, what you need to do is you need to put on a fairly heavy headset tethered to a computer, and for that you get one really, really great experience and then 9 sort of like mediocre experiences. But if we can develop more good experiences, I think it will help adoption. And so, to do my part to get more people making better content, I basically started what became this book, which it's a how-to book specifically about 360 video. As many of you probably know, VR is broader. When you talk about VR, we're talking about a lot of CG. We're generally talking about an environment where you can move around freely within the world, whereas 360 video is mostly limited to you can turn your head, you can look up and down, but you can't actually move around. But on the other hand, it is actual video. You can set up a camera, turn it on, and have content instantly, which is a lot quicker than developing a VR application. So it is sort of like a gateway to full VR. And the good news is that it's quite easy to get started with. The bad news is, or if it's bad news, that the challenge is that to do it well is still quite an ordeal. And what I have found is that, especially for people who have a background in traditional filmmaking, it's almost harder, because it appears to be very similar to traditional filmmaking, both production and post. But when you actually get into it, you'll find that it's actually quite different. So anyway, I've got a little slideshow I'm going to walk through, and starting with some basics for people who don't know anything about it. I won't dwell too long on really rudimentary stuff, but how do we create 360 video? Basically, what you're doing is you're creating a sphere of video, like as if basically like you stick your head inside of a globe and turn around and look around the walls of the globe. Well, the easiest way to get that is to create a camera system where the cameras are pointing out in all directions. And this can be something as elaborate as this one here, or as simple and small as something like this. And the truth is that while the quality of the first one is a lot higher for the master, by the time it gets to the end viewer, most people are going to be watching it at a level that's not going to be all that different than this little guy is pumping out. And so, especially while learning, I think there's a real advantage to working with some of the more consumer-oriented equipment, partially because it also incorporates stitching, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. These are two more of the more popular cameras that are being used right now. The top one is made by a company called Zcam. This was a successful Kickstarter, and this is the S1. This is about the size of like a tall boy beer, maybe a little fatter. And now they have a S1 Pro, which has a little bit better lenses on it, and that's got 4 lenses. And then at the bottom, that's just 4 Blackmagic micro cinema cameras rigged together. And anyway, and there are a number of other rigs, both all built-in ones like the top, or just rigs, mechanisms where you can attach GoPros or Blackmagic cameras or things like that. So those are 2 of the more popular ones that I've seen people using a lot more recently. The fundamental process is you take the output of those cameras and you stitch them together into a sphere. And so this is sort of a very simple view of that. You take your individual elements and they are digitally wrapped into this single image. But the truth is, when we're working with this footage, especially in post, we generally work with what's called an equirectangular or a lat long, and this is a representation of that spherical video in a 4x3, or not 4x3 rather, it's 2x1 actually, but in a rectangular format. And this allows all of the software that you currently work with that handles rectangular video to work with this spherical video. And while it takes a little getting used to looking at this footage, I remember the first few times I was looking at this stuff, I was just sort of, I couldn't even make sense of it. After you do it for a very short amount of time, you very quickly begin to see past it. And I look at this and I barely even notice that it looks weird. And what it is it's a distortion of that sphere, the same way we do with a globe. So the way you take a globe and you stretch it out to make it look like a flat map, it's basically exactly the same process. And the advantage is that it's now a rectangle, and so you can store it in a regular file on a computer and work with it. The bad news is that it is distorted in a number of ways. And most obviously, you'll notice that the Antarctica there is pretty huge, and Antarctica is not that big and shrinking, but it is certainly not that big compared to the other continents, right? And this happens with 360 video as well. And so if you look at this image here, the top is showing a lat long, and that white area that's highlighted, this is the base of the camera. This was just like a little stand, like this mic stand here. And it was just a little square stand. But you see in the lat long at the top there, it takes up a lot of space on the screen. And this is fine if you're not, for many operations that you're working with, you'll just ignore that and work with the file. But for doing visual effects and things where you need to manipulate the pixels of the frame, this becomes a problem. And so there are other ways of looking at your video. And so this, on the bottom there, that sideways cross there, this is what's called a cube map or a cubic projection. And that's as if you took a three-dimensional cube and unwrapped it. This is essentially what you're looking at there. And each of those sides, each of those squares, is the pixels are effectively the same as they are in a normal one-to-one representation. And so you see that camera base is actually very small and would be very simple to paint out, which is one of the steps that we frequently do when we're working with 360 videos to eliminate the camera whatever the camera support and other evidence. So these are different ways that we work with the footage in the post side of things. But then in order to view it, it is wrapped back on it, for the viewing process, it's wrapped back onto a sphere, and that can be viewed in a number of ways. And so this is sort of a really nice, simple representation of how you can look at it looking at it on a cell phone, right? And again, most of you sounds like you've done some of this, so you know what it looks like when it's wrapped onto a sphere. It's a lot more effective if you're holding your phone up and turning it around, right? And that's one of the nice things about the working with a phone with a gyroscope in it. You can literally look around and see the whole extent of the sphere and get a little bit more sense. But when you put it onto a pair of goggles, the experience transforms again. And the difference of watching a video with goggles on, where you literally can turn your head and the natural experience of looking at something in the world is replicated in the video, that's when the magic starts to happen. That's when you really start to have this transformative experience when the content is created well. And I'll come back to that a few times, because I think when the content is created poorly, it can be nauseating, it can be really pretty unpleasant. But when it's done well, you really have this transformative experience where you don't feel like you are watching a movie. as much as you feel like you are in a new place, where you really feel like you are physically in another place. And the people that you're seeing look the same. They're the same distance as they are, in real life. Like the mapping is all mapped to a very naturalistic, realistic situation. And so it really is a very different experience than watching a traditional movie. Just a couple more little technical aspects here. The more cameras you have, the more stitch lines you have. And so stitching is this area where the images need to be, from the original cameras, need to be connected. Stitch lines are, your enemy when you're working in 360 video. And so there's this dilemma of how many cameras is the ultimate number, the right number of cameras to work with. The more cameras, the more stitch lines. The more stitch lines, the more likely there are issues. And so there's sort of a balance that you're working with there. And I can talk a little bit more about some of there are a lot of cameras now that have there are a lot of 360 rigs that are based around a lot of cameras, 24 cameras, 18 cameras. And these have enough overlap, because there's so many cameras, that the stitching can be done algorithmically, mostly. And so that sort of attempts to solve this problem a little bit. And we're almost there. We're not quite there, but we're getting there. And I think soon or eventually we'll certainly get to the point where the stitching process will be something that is mostly done automatically and is not something that's a manual task. Presently, the truth is that you can get about 80–90% of the way there for most shots. Some shots you can get 100% of the way there, but often there's still a little bit of manual tweaking required to get things to look perfect. And often there's the trade-off of how much effort is it worth to make it perfect, especially depending on how long the shot is on screen. Is somebody really going to be looking in every direction? You got one bad stitch line behind you, you live with it and you move on. Anyway, so this dilemma of working with your stitch lines is still one of the big technical obstacles to working in 360. But really, what's much more relevant is how we think about creating 360 content. And so I sort of started this thinking like, well, I know how to make movies. I've been doing that for a long time. Now I'm just making a movie, except the camera points in all directions. There's some complications, but how different can it be? But just as when you watch a 360 video, and again, I'm talking more about the ideal situation where you're wearing goggles, where you have spatialized sound, where it is a fully immersive experience, it's a really different experience than watching a video. It really is more of you're going to a place. And if you think of it that way, that really can impact the way you think about creating your content. And so just to say broadly that this presentation is skewed a little bit more towards post, because I know that most of you are on the post side of things, but I'm sort of talking a little bit more broadly at first. So again, like when you step up to a 360 production in general, at first it seems fairly similar. You're essentially working with a camera. The camera has SD cards or whatever. You still got media you're capturing the image of light through a lens. You're generally working with photographing people or places or objects. It's all fundamentally familiar. We use lighting, although that becomes an issue if you don't want the light to be seen. But the basic apparatus is fairly similar, but fundamentally it changes every aspect of the process when you think about it a little bit differently. And rather than thinking of it as creating a movie, you think of it more as creating a world. And so this begins with development and scripting and thinking the types of projects that lend themselves to this medium. And I think this is another piece of the dilemma, is that not everybody or a lot of people are having trouble figuring out what would make a good 360 video. And actually, as part of my research for the book, I talked to actually about 30 different people, filmmakers, technologists, tool makers, people in post, people in production, and I really tried to get a lot of different opinions about how this stuff should be done, because no one knows yet. We're still defining it. And I got a lot of different answers, especially on this topic. Some people were like, anything, when you make a movie, you're trying to make something that's realistic. The more realistic, the more naturalistic you can make it, the better. Doing it in 360 just makes it that much more naturalistic. So anything would be better in 360, and that's one side of the spectrum. And another side of the spectrum is when you try to force your viewer to tell them where to look, which is face it, most of what we do with traditional film, right? It's all about telling you where to look. That doesn't work in 360. You can't tell your viewer where to look. They're going to look wherever they want. And there are all sorts of tools to help guide their focus, but ultimately they are going to have their own experience. And so, another school of thought is that videos or content that is more narrative driven or is more story driven is less well suited, and things that are more experiential or place driven or event driven. I mean, it works well for sports and for news events. Big events like that are fairly natural places. Oh, I just want to be at Burning Man. Oh, well, put on the goggles and you're there. And there are ways in which those sort of content naturally lend themselves to this medium. Personally, I think the reality is somewhere in the middle. I think that there are certainly room for narrative elements and room for storytelling within this medium, but you do need to meet it on its own terms. And again, just that idea that your approach needs to change from traditional filmmaking affects every aspect. So looking for locations is different. You need to think about not only is the set going to match what your expectations are, and of course be able to be seen in all directions, but by the way, your whole crew is going to need to hide. So where are they going to go? And and if you're going to be monitoring, which hopefully you are, monitoring is its own whole nightmare of how you monitor the 360 content. You can't be standing behind the camera, although you can in some contexts, but it really affects the prep and the pre-production as well. The creative options on the shoot are fundamentally different. All of the tools that a DP uses to help guide that point of focus, the vast majority of them are gone. You can't choose a focal length. I mean, there's some variance in which cameras you use are using different focal length lenses, but by and large, the end result is intended to be a natural sphere where everything is at natural distance. So everything is at this effective 50 millimeter result once you unstitch the circle. And so you don't have focal lengths, you don't have focus, right? It's all as much depth of field as possible. Although again, some filmmakers are starting to experiment with this and play with even racking focus within a 360 scene. Although my experience, the one case I saw, that was on the nauseating side of things. But a lot of the tools, framing. I mean, there's no inserts, right? You can't. Editing itself is a fundamental, it falls apart in a lot of ways in a 360 world. And again, there are cases where you can do it a little bit, but you really need to meet this medium on its own terms. So all of those elements really fall apart. And again, placement of the camera, the way we compose a shot for 360, when you think about composition, we generally use the boundaries of our frame as a fundamental aspect of how we compose. How close is it to the edge? How close is it to the center? Well, there is no edge. Right? There's now just a circle. It's unlimited. And so thinking about how we create spherical composition requires a new approach. And anyway, and then monitoring, as I mentioned before, is its own whole nightmare. And post equally challenging in all sorts of ways. While, the whole addition of, I think, there's additional steps that go on throughout the post process, from the stitching and rig removal, like getting rid of the tripod and things, which, there's some of that sometimes on a traditional shoot, but on 360 it's kind of a fairly standard part of the process. On the other hand, there's very little intra-scene editing. Sometimes there is, but most of the time your scenes are one shot, and you may choose a best take, and you may mix and match elements of a take, which is, you can do some cool things with split screens. There's a lot of really powerful, using the idea of the split screen really opens up a tremendous amount of versatility in terms of both shooting and post. And so that's an area that I've really focused on a little bit, although it's not really part of this presentation, but the idea of effectively you can necessarily stand behind the camera as long as you shoot a plate that you can then replace that piece, because in that sphere you can just peel off one of the segments and replace it with a different take from a different shot. And if the camera's locked off, that's a relatively simple operation to do. And so you can do that with takes. You can have, as long as no one crosses over a stitch line, you can take segment A, the north section, for example, from take 1, and the south section or the east section from take 3, and you can mix and match takes as long as nobody crosses over that stitch line. And so while shooting, it's very important to think about, to know where your stitch lines are and to manage that a little bit. Anyway, so these are some of just the broader aspects of how 360 is different. And then I'm going to basically just highlight a handful of these things here. Again, mostly a little bit, well, it's a little bit mix of post and production. But this fundamental idea, though, of world building, not storytelling, is a really cool idea. It also changes a little bit of the priorities on set. So locations are absolutely critical because your audience is going to be in that location. And so choosing your locations becomes, you know, as important as choosing your actors or your subject for that matter, which is, again, always true to some extent, but with 360 it becomes really paramount. And as well, set design and set observation, thinking about what are the details of your set. A lot of smaller budget projects, and again, this doesn't just apply to narrative, this applies to an interview, this applies to you know, real world news gathering. Paying attention to exactly what's visible in the scene becomes especially critical because most 360 projects are done in a way where the audience is dropped into that environment and they're free to look around. And so you need to really be thinking about that. And so the production design aspect of your production becomes equally important to the DP, if not more important. And you know, I'll leave that to any production designers or DPs to argue about. But that production design element of your production becomes much more important. And it's, you know, I've always felt that it's incredibly important on any traditional project, but it really takes another level, and in some cases becomes more important than your DP because your DP's options are so limited. And so that, again, just requires a little bit of rethinking your approach in terms of that. And then, of course, you need to be looking in every direction when you set up a shot. You can no longer, you know, if the lighting is not consistent, if you've got a blown out window behind you, or if you want to add a light, that's going to create issues. That's going to, you know, your end result is going to be seen. So that is sort of, you know, that broad sense of thinking of your project as world building instead of storytelling, I think is a helpful starting point that impacts everything. In terms of the actual shooting, every role on set is different. I mean, everything from sound, I mean, you can't have a boom, and you know, you can't have somebody standing there with a boom, so everything winds up you doing a lot more reliance on lavaliers and on wireless and plant mics and things like that. And I'll talk briefly at the end a little bit about ambisonic audio, and there's amazing things that you can do with audio that, like in traditional production, audio often is the most important thing to create an immersive experience. It's doubly true in 360 as well. All right. So, you know, the limits to those tools that I was talking about before, we don't have a focal length or focus or framing. This idea about thinking more like theater, that you've got the tools that you use to guide your audience's point of focus are lighting changes, sound changes, blocking, and thinking about acting must be different because when you put on a headset and you've got another person standing 5 feet from you, it has to be naturalistic in a way that is different from a close-up on a traditional film and is different than a theater actor 20 feet from you on a stage. And so it really requires a very different approach. And then in terms of thinking of the choreography and the blocking on set, where emotional moments should happen close to your camera and more action-related moments should happen further away from the camera. And so you really do need to approach it in that way. And generally what happens is you wind up spending a tremendous more time prepping a shot, and then the actual rolling of the shot is relatively short. On the post side of things, there are, as I said before, minimal intra-scene editing. Monitoring becomes tricky. I just have a little video showing here, like this is the basic Premiere window where you've got a 360 shot and you can set a second viewer to show what it looks like through the headset. And so while you're working, you can be looking both at that secondary view to see the limited area that you're looking at any given time, as well as looking at the full lat long, the full equirectangular, to look out for any bogeys or issues or anything else that might you know, be creating an issue. But so that, you know, you need to be monitoring both. While you're working in post, it gets easy to sort of forget about what's going on in the headset and just like, yeah, I know what the content's going to be. I know that the viewer's going to be looking around anywhere they want. I'm just going to focus on the, you know, I'm going to look at the big picture. And it's really easy to get yourself tripped up by doing that, because you really need to be thinking about where in the frame things are going to be looking. And Oh, and then there's this fundamental, for anybody who remembers, the old offline-online model, well, it's back because you work with these quick stitches, which are low res, very, they're not quick, they're not processor intensive, but they enable you to see a rough shot, but they have big problems. Like you see that guy's head is cut off and the ceiling is all distorted, and here's the fine stitch version of that same shot. You basically wind up doing this offline-online work model. And not just for the stitching, but also for stereo versus mono and other elements. So we're back to this offline-online model, unfortunately. Within editing, I just was going to point out one cool element that is maybe a little bit complicated, but this idea of the center point, where is the default center, becomes a really critical part of your editing process. And so I've got here a little sequence. You've got the first frame and end frame of 3 shots, or the first 2 and just the first frame of the 3rd shot. The red line is the center point, the point of focus. And so you've got those people walking from the center of the frame towards the left, and then at the cut point, we match the center point so that the people are still at that matched point. Well, then they walk further to the left, and then by the 3rd shot, they're all the way to the edge of the frame. Well, what that means is that if you're looking at it in a headset, the people are way over here. And that's really uncomfortable, and then how do you get them back? And so while you're editing, one of the tricks that we're frequently adjusting is adjusting those center points and backing up in time. So if I know that that 3rd shot's going to push them all the way over there, I might adjust where I start the first shot. So by moving the first shot to the right, now by the time we get to that 3rd shot, we're further, we're more closer to the center. And so this becomes another really fundamental piece of what it means to edit 360 video. That becomes a pretty critical thing. When working with effects, this is also an area where things are pretty different. Because if you put an ordinary, any sort of convolution effect, a blur, a sharpen, anything that adjusts the edges of the pixels, you're going to wind up affecting the edges of the frame. Well, remember, while you're looking at a rectangle, really what you've got is a sphere. And so the left edge and the right edge connect. And so if you apply a filter that touches the edges of your frame, it's not going to work. It's going to create a seam line. And so this iris is an extreme example where, so here is, this is a 360 aware filter or a transition. This is a special transition made for 360. You see, for one thing, it bleeds over onto the left edge there. It also is distorted because, again, if you remember that world map, like the whole image is distorted, that what looked like a circle in your editing room is not going to look like a circle when you're looking at it in the headset. This will look like a circle in the headset, and so you need to be thinking about that in terms of a wide variety of different types of effects. It's also for titles. If you just slap on a regular title, it's going to look really weird, giant and distorted when you look at it in the headset. You need to correct that. So here's the same title put in a little bit more carefully, and you see how tiny it looks in the lat long on the top, and that makes it look an appropriate size when you're looking at it in the headset in the bottom there. So, there are tons of other things that really impact you, and audio is so huge, and that affects both the recording side of it as well as the mixing and the panning. That picture there is a plug-in, an ambisonic mixing panner, so you can see your lat long and you can pin sounds to specific spots in your audio and also animate them, right? So you can have sounds that move naturally that follow subjects in your frame. It affects your camera positions, lighting decisions, anyway, everything throughout the process. That was sort of my broad point. Also dealing with exporting, you've got special metadata so that viewers can know whether your video is 360 or not, whether it's stereo or mono, and whether it's got spatialized sound or not. And that's the sort of thing that will probably become increasingly invisible. But at this point, if you're doing 360 projects, keeping track of that metadata is unfortunately one of these little hassles that's really easy to screw up. And then, of course, because the market is so fragmented right now, each different delivery venue, be it YouTube or Vimeo or Little Star, which is a 360-specific video sharing site, or any of these other players, they often have different needs for the specific requirements. Some will take stereo top-bottom, some side-to-side, some have different maximum resolution values, and there's a lot of, you can't really rely on a single output master, so you wind up having to make a whole bunch of these individual masters, and so on. So anyway, I have a couple minutes if there's any questions about this stuff. Obviously, it's a massive topic, but please.
I have a number of questions.
The question was, Are there cylindrical projection screens? And the answer is yes. What I've seen haven't been cylindrical, they've been spherical, right? So there are domes.
Lights up?
Yeah. Lights up, please.
Yeah. Lights up.
Lights up.
Justin, lights up.
So there are, and it's a really cool thing because it allows multiple people to share the 360 experience together, right? And I've seen some of those at trade shows and things. The quality have been like, almost there. I feel like there's another generation before it's really more viable, but I think it definitely will become another venue for how to exhibit this stuff.